The last thing my daughter ever asked me for wasn't a toy. It wasn't a trip to Disney World. It wasn't even more time. Though God knows I would have given her every second I had left in me if I could have. She asked me to make sure no other child would ever have to feel alone the way she did. And I had no idea, standing in that hospital room with the smell of antiseptic in the air and the soft beeping of machines marking every breath she took, that those words would one day travel farther than either of us could have ever imagined. I had no idea that my 7-year-old daughter, who still slept with a stuffed rabbit named Captain Biscuit and could recite every line of every Pixar movie ever made, would one day change a law. But she did, and I want to tell you how. My name is Rachel Calloway. I'm 41 years old now, though some days I feel much older than that, and some days, when the light falls just right through the kitchen window the way it used to when she was eating her cereal, I feel like I'm right back there at the beginning, when everything was still ordinary and safe and full of the kind of noise that only small children can make. Ellie was born on a Tuesday in April. The first thing she did when she came into the world was sneeze. Not cry. Sneeze. And then she opened her eyes, these dark, serious eyes, and she looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as deeply unimpressed, as if she had expected something better. My husband Daniel laughed so hard he had to sit down. The nurses smiled, and I just stared at this small, frowning, magnificent person and thought, who are you? I spent the next 7 years trying to figure that out. I don't think I ever fully did. I think that's the thing about children, the real thing nobody tells you. You don't get to know all of them. You get pieces, moments, the way she sang to herself while she colored, the very specific way she pronounced the word spaghetti with a hard T at the end, as if she were announcing something important. The way she would crawl into our bed at 3 in the morning and arrange herself like a starfish between Daniel and me, taking up more space than any creature her size should have been able to take. She was funny in a way that children aren't always funny, not performing for adults funny, genuinely funny. She noticed things. She made connections. She had a way of saying something so quietly true that it would stop you mid-sentence, and you'd have to think about it for the rest of the day. She was also fiercely, almost irrationally kind. That was the word people always used about Ellie. Kind. Not sweet, not polite, but kind. There's a difference. Sweet is surface. Kind is something you choose, even when it's hard. Ellie chose it constantly and without fanfare. I remember once, in the year before everything changed, she came home from school with a look on her face I recognized. That tight, trying not to cry look. I asked her what happened, and she told me about a girl in her class. A girl named Maya, who had eaten lunch alone for 3 days in a row, because the group she used to sit with had moved to a different table and no one had invited her along. Ellie had noticed. Ellie had counted 3 days. I asked her what she did. She said, I sat with her today. And then she shrugged like it was the smallest thing in the world. It was the biggest thing in the world. That was my daughter. The headaches started in October. She mentioned it once on a Thursday, casually, the way children do when they're not sure if something is worth bothering you about. My head hurts a little. I gave her some water and checked for a fever and thought nothing more of it. But then it happened again, and then again. And then one morning she woke up and couldn't see clearly out of her left eye, just for a minute, just a flickering blurriness that scared her and scared me more than I let on. We went to the pediatrician. The pediatrician referred us to a specialist. The specialist ordered scans. I remember the waiting room. I remember the particular shade of blue the chairs were, this pale, washed-out blue that was supposed to be calming and was instead the color of held breath. I remember Ellie sitting next to me with Captain Biscuit in her lap, asking me if the machine that was going to take pictures of her brain was like the one in Spy Kids. I said yes, exactly like that one. She seemed satisfied with this answer. Daniel was on his way. He'd been at a meeting when I called and had left the moment I said the word specialist, and he was driving across the city and texting me one-word messages. On my way and almost there and love you, while I sat in those pale blue chairs and tried to keep my breathing steady. The doctor's name was Dr. Anand Mehta. He was a soft-spoken man with reading glasses he wore low on his nose and a way of choosing his words carefully that I came to understand. Over the following weeks was not caution but genuine care. He called us into his office after the scan results came back. He offered us water. He sat down across from us and he folded his hands on the desk and he looked at us with eyes that already held the answer before he said a word. And I knew. I knew before he opened his mouth. Daniel held my hand so tightly it went numb. A brain tumor. A pediatric brain tumor located in a part of the brain that made surgery extraordinarily complicated. He used words like aggressive and inoperable and treatment options, and I heard all of them and also none of them because somewhere in the middle of those words, the world had quietly ended, and I was sitting in the rubble of it trying to understand how any of this could be real. Ellie was in the waiting room with a nurse and a pile of coloring books. She did not know yet. We had to decide how to tell her. How do you tell a 7-year-old that her brain has a shadow in it that the doctors can't take away? How do you explain to a child who still believes in the possibility of magic, who leaves notes for fairies in the garden, and talks to the dog like he speaks English, that the world has limits you cannot argue with and love cannot fix? We told her that night at home in her room with the fairy lights strung above her bed, casting everything in soft gold. We told her that there was something in her head that the doctors were going to work very hard to make better. We told her it was going to be a tough road. We told her we would be with her every single step of it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Is it going to hurt?" We said, "Sometimes, probably. But we will make it hurt as little as possible." She nodded. She reached for Captain Biscuit, and then she said, "Okay." And I will never, for as long as I live, understand how a 7-year-old finds okay in a moment like that. I will never stop being in awe of it. The months that followed were the longest and the shortest of my life. Long, because time moves differently in hospitals. It stretches and folds in on itself. A single afternoon can feel like a week. Waiting for test results is its own kind of eternity, a suspended state where normal life continues around you like a river and you are a stone at the bottom of it, still and heavy and unable to move. Short, because between the appointments and the treatments and the fierce ordinary moments, there was Ellie, and when Ellie was in a room, time had a way of filling up completely. She didn't allow for empty spaces. She filled them with questions and stories and games she invented and songs she made up and observations about the world that were so precise they made you catch your breath. She made friends in the oncology ward. This surprised me at first, how quickly and how deeply she connected with other children there. There was a boy named Jacob, 8 years old, missing half his hair from chemo, who shared her obsession with animated movies and spent hours with her debating the scientific accuracy of various fictional worlds. There was a girl named Priya, 10 years old, quiet and careful and absolutely devastating on a chessboard, who taught Ellie the basics of the game over several slow afternoons. There was a little boy, only 5, named Thomas, who rarely spoke and had eyes the color of rain, and who would sit beside Ellie during treatment sometimes and let her hold his hand without either of them saying a word. These children. These extraordinary, extraordinary children. I watched my daughter in those months become something I can only describe as more herself, as if the ordinary friction of ordinary life had been stripped away, and what was left was the essential Ellie, bright and clear and completely without pretense. She laughed more than I would have believed possible. She asked the nurses their names and remembered them. She drew pictures constantly, filling sketchbook after sketchbook with detailed, imaginative worlds. Creatures with wings and castles and clouds and detailed maps of places that existed only in her mind. She also asked questions. Hard ones, the kind children aren't supposed to ask and adults don't know how to answer. One evening in the early winter, she was lying in the hospital bed and I was in the chair beside her, reading aloud to her a chapter book about a girl who discovers a secret garden. And she stopped me mid-sentence and asked Mom, what happens if the medicine doesn't work? I closed the book. I put it in my lap. I looked at her. I told her the truth. As gently as I could, as carefully as I could, but the truth. I told her that if the medicine didn't work, the doctors would try different things and that we would never stop trying. I told her that whatever happened, she would not be alone. Not for a single second. She looked at the ceiling for a while. Then she said, "The other kids here are scared. Did you know that?" I said yes, I imagined they were. She said, "I don't think they should have to be scared by themselves." I asked her what she meant. She was quiet again for a moment. She said, when something bad is happening, it's worse if nobody's there with you, even if they can't fix it. Just being there makes it less bad. I said, "You're right." It does. She turned to look at me and she said, "But some of the kids, their parents can't always be here. Because of work, or because they live far away, or because there's other kids at home. And that's not fair, Mom. That's really not fair." I didn't know what to say to that. I agreed with her. It wasn't fair. It was one of the thousands of unfair things about being sick when you're small and the world keeps moving without slowing down for you. She said, someone should fix that. She didn't say it as a wish. She said it as a fact, the way she said everything important, quietly and without decoration. Someone should fix that. I didn't know in that moment that she had already decided it would be her. The treatment worked, and then it didn't. There were 3 months in the late winter and early spring where things were better. The tumor responded to a combination of radiation and a targeted therapy that Dr. Mehta described with cautious optimism, a phrase I held onto with both hands, cautious optimism. I wrote it down. I said it to myself in the car on the way to and from the hospital. I built a small, carefully constructed house of hope out of those 2 words, and I lived in it as faithfully as I could. Ellie's headaches lessened. Her vision stabilized. There was a Tuesday in March when we drove to the park for the first time in months, and she actually ran across the grass toward the swings, and Daniel and I stood at the edge of the park holding hands and watching her, and I thought, this is it. This is the turn. This is the moment the story becomes the kind we were hoping for. I want to tell you that I was right about that. I want to tell you that was how it went. In April, a new scan showed that the tumor had begun growing again. Dr. Mehta called us in. He had a colleague with him this time, a specialist in pediatric neuro-oncology who had flown in from a hospital 3 states away to review Ellie's case. They had explored every option. They had consulted with colleagues internationally. There were no further surgical options. There were trials, experimental protocols, things we could try, but Dr. Mehta was honest with us. The way he had always been honest with us, which I was grateful for even as it destroyed me. He said, "We will not give up, but I want you to understand what we are facing." We understood. We drove home in silence. Daniel pulled the car over twice because he couldn't see through what was happening to his face. I sat in the passenger seat with my hands in my lap and watched the city go by outside the window and thought about nothing and everything simultaneously, which is a particular kind of grief that has no name I know of. Ellie was at home with my sister who had driven up from 2 states away to help. She was asleep when we got home. We stood in her doorway for a long time, Daniel and I, watching her breathe in the soft dark of her room, Captain Biscuit tucked under one arm. The fairy lights still on because she'd asked us never to turn them off. We made a decision that night. We would spend whatever time we had left making it the most alive time we possibly could. No more speaking in hushed voices around her. No more of that particular careful grief we'd been carrying like something fragile and explosive. We would tell her the truth, gently, in the right moment. And we would ask her what she wanted to do and where she wanted to go and who she wanted to be with. And we would do all of it, every single thing we could. She already knew more than we thought she did. Children always do. It was a Sunday in May when she told me. We were sitting on the back porch, just the two of us. Daniel was inside, making the elaborate and not entirely successful brunch he had taken to making every Sunday, because Ellie had declared that Sunday brunch was her favorite tradition, and he was determined to provide it regardless of his limited culinary abilities. The smell of slightly burnt toast was drifting out through the screen door. Ellie was in her favorite chair, a little wooden rocking chair we'd found at a yard sale when she was 4 and that she still fit into if she curled up just right. She had a sketchbook open in her lap, but she wasn't drawing. She was looking at the garden, where the first of the spring flowers were doing their brave and annual business of appearing despite everything. She said, "Mom, I want to tell you something I've been thinking about." I said, "Okay." She said, "I know things aren't going to get better. I know the medicine isn't working the way it was supposed to." I said, "Who told you that?" She gave me a look. She was 7 years old, and she gave me a look that said, "I'm not 5, Mom. I've been watching. I listen. I know." I said, "You're right. Things are harder right now." She nodded like she'd expected me to confirm it. Then she said, "I've been thinking about what I want." I said, "Tell me." She said, "I want a lot of things. I want to go to the ocean one more time. I want to see the fireworks on the 4th of July. I want to be there when Daisy has her puppies." My sister's dog was pregnant, and Ellie was desperately invested in this. "I want to finish the sketchbook I'm working on." She listed these things calmly, like items on a grocery list, and each one hit me in the chest like a small, precise stone. Then she paused, and she said, "But the most important thing I want is something different." I waited. She said, "You know, the other kids at the hospital? The ones whose parents can't always be there." I said, "I remembered." She said, "I've been thinking about that a lot. I think the reason parents can't always come is because of their jobs. Because they might lose their job if they miss too much work, or because they don't get paid if they don't go, and that isn't their fault. They love their kids, they just can't afford to stay." I looked at her. I was looking at a 7-year-old who had understood something that legislators and policymakers had debated for years, who had arrived at it not through research or politics, but through simple, fierce observation and love. She said, "I want there to be a rule, like a law or something, that says parents don't have to choose between being with their sick kid and keeping their job, that they can stay without being punished for it, that they get paid to stay." I said, "Ellie." She said, "I know it's a big thing. I know I'm just a kid. But you always told me that big things start with somebody noticing them and saying something. So I'm saying something." And then she reached into her sketchbook and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it out to me. She said, "I wrote it down. I made a list of the reasons why it should happen, in case it would help." I opened the paper. I still have it. I will always have it. It is not a legal document. It is not a petition. It is a sheet of wide-ruled notebook paper in purple crayon and careful second-grade handwriting, with a list of reasons why parents should be allowed to stay with their sick children without losing their jobs or their pay. It had 6 points. 3 of them were illustrated with small drawings. It was the most important piece of paper I have ever held. I said, Ellie, I promise you I will do everything I can. She said, I know, Mom. I trust you. Those 4 words. I trust you. They were the most terrifying words I had ever heard in my life. They were also the most sacred. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because it was not immediate and it was not clean. And there were long stretches of time in which I did not know if the promise I had made could ever be kept. We did go to the ocean. We drove down to the coast at the beginning of June, the 3 of us and my sister and her husband and their dog Daisy, who had by then delivered a litter of 4 puppies, one of which Ellie named Admiral Fluffington and held for approximately 4 hours straight. We walked on the beach in the early evening when the light was going golden, and Ellie collected shells with the focused intensity she brought to everything, filling her pockets until they were heavy and then filling mine. She stood at the edge of the water and let it rush over her feet, and she closed her eyes and tipped her face up to the sky, and she looked like she was listening to something. I didn't ask her what. Some things belong only to the person having them. We came home. July came. She saw the fireworks from the front yard, wrapped in a blanket on the porch swing, her head against Daniel's shoulder, the sky above our neighborhood cracking open with color. She said it was the best show she'd ever seen. She said this every year, which Daniel and I had always found funny, but this year we didn't laugh. We just agreed. It was the best show. Through all of this, I was making calls. I was writing emails. I was reaching out to anyone I could think of. It started with Ellie's sketchbook list and a conversation with a woman named Carol Hendricks, who ran a nonprofit focused on family support for pediatric illness. I connected with her through the hospital's family services coordinator, a warm, endlessly resourceful woman named Sandra, who had quietly become one of the most important people in our lives. I told Carol about Ellie's idea. I read her the purple crayon list. There was a silence on the other end of the phone that lasted long enough that I checked to make sure the call was still connected. Carol said, "How old is your daughter?" I said 7. She said, "I'd like to meet her." They met on a Tuesday afternoon in the hospital's family room, a space full of mismatched furniture and old magazines, and a window that looked out onto a small courtyard with a single tree in it. Ellie had her sketchbook. Carol had a notebook. They talked for almost an hour. I sat in the corner and tried to be furniture. Ellie explained her idea. She talked about the families she had watched over her months in the hospital. She described, in concrete detail, the look on a child's face when a parent had to leave, the particular way a small person's body changed when the person they most needed in the world walked out through the door, not because they wanted to, but because the world required it of them. She said it's a specific kind of sad. It's different from other sad. It's the sad of being let down by something that's not a person's fault. Carol wrote everything down. She looked at me periodically with an expression I could not quite decode. Something between astonishment and a kind of professional urgency I recognized as the look of someone who has just found the thing they were looking for. She asked Ellie what she thought should change. Ellie told her. Extended paid family leave for critical illness of a child, not just the initial diagnosis, but the ongoing treatment period. Job protection so a parent couldn't be dismissed or penalized for taking the leave. She said, some of this stuff maybe already exists a little bit in some places, but not enough, and not everywhere, and not in a way that actually works for people who don't have fancy jobs with lots of sick days. Carol said, "You've thought about this a lot." Ellie said, "I've had a lot of time in this hospital." Carol introduced me to a woman named Patricia Weston, a state legislator who had spent much of her career working on family policy. Patricia was a tall woman with gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the kind of directness that comes from spending decades in rooms where every word is contested. She read Ellie's list. She asked me several careful questions about the policy landscape and what specifically we were hoping to achieve. I told her I was not a lobbyist. I was not a policy expert. I was a mother who had made a promise to her daughter. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Those are sometimes the most effective people in the room." The first meeting with Patricia was in August. Ellie was not well enough to attend. She had had a difficult few weeks, new symptoms, new adjustments to medications, stretches of days when the headaches made the light intolerable, and she stayed in her darkened room with Captain Biscuit and audiobooks and the particular brave silence of someone enduring something. I kept her informed. One reported back every evening. She listened carefully and asked good questions, and on more than one occasion corrected my understanding of what she actually wanted. No mom, not just paid leave. Paid leave with no ceiling on the number of days, because what if a child is sick for a long time? She was thinking further ahead than I was. Or maybe she was thinking about the children who would come after her. I think it was that. In September, a journalist named Marcus Webb wrote a piece about our family for a regional newspaper. I had agreed to the interview cautiously, unsure how I felt about the public nature of it, but Carol convinced me, and ultimately Ellie convinced me. She said if it helps people know about the idea, then we should do it. She said I don't mind people knowing about me. The piece ran on a Sunday. By Monday evening, Carol had forwarded me so many emails that my phone stopped making notification sounds simply from exhaustion. The story had been picked up by 3 national outlets by Tuesday. By the end of the week, it had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. The comments. I have not read all the comments. I cannot, but I have read some. I have read the ones from parents who wrote about their own experiences, the boss who docked their pay, the job they lost, the morning they had to choose between staying at their child's bedside and paying their rent. I have read comments from nurses who described what it looked like on their ward when a parent was absent versus present, the difference it made to a child's recovery, to their fear level, to their willingness to endure treatment. I have read comments from adult survivors of childhood illness who wrote about the memory of a parent having to leave, the particular wound of it, and the equal memory, those lucky enough to have it, of a parent who stayed, the way that staying had shaped something fundamental in them. Ellie read some too. I let her, carefully choosing what I showed her. She read quietly, and then she said, "I didn't know it was that many people." I said, "It's a lot of people." She said, "Good. Then maybe something will actually happen." Things happened. They happened slowly, the way things usually do when you are asking institutions to move, but they happened. Patricia Weston began drafting a bill. She worked with Carol's organization, with a team of policy researchers, and with a coalition of advocacy groups that had existed for years, working on exactly these issues, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. There were setbacks. There were legislators who were skeptical. There were debates about cost, about implementation, about the definition of critical illness, about the rights of small businesses. Patricia sent me updates regularly. I shared them with Ellie in the simplified, honest way I had learned to communicate with her. Not pretending things were easier than they were, but holding the thread of why it mattered, even when the path was hard. There was a day in October when it looked like the bill might stall entirely. A key vote that was needed had fallen through. Patricia called me at 7 in the evening and explained the situation, and I sat at the kitchen table, with the phone in my hand after the call ended, and I felt the specific despair of someone watching a wall rise between a promise and its fulfillment. I went to Ellie's room. She was awake, though she often went to bed early by then. She was drawing, slowly, by the light of her fairy lights. I told her what had happened. I told her the truth. I said it was hard and it might not work, at least not in the way or time we had hoped. She was quiet for a while. She looked at what she was drawing, which was, I could see from where I was sitting, a map of an imaginary world, richly detailed, full of small, careful legends and symbols. She said, "Mom, even if it doesn't happen while I'm here, it might still happen." I said, "Yes." She said, "And even if it takes a long time, it's still worth trying. Because the next kid in this hospital right now, whose parent can't stay, they matter too, even if I never meet them." I said, "Yes, you're right." She said, "Don't stop." "Promise me you won't stop." I said, "I promise." She went back to her drawing. I went to the hallway and stood with my back against the wall in the dark and pressed my hands over my mouth and let myself fall apart quietly and privately for about 3 minutes. And then I went back in and sat beside her and watched her draw her imaginary world. The second attempt at the vote came in November. Patricia had spent 6 weeks reworking the coalition, addressing the specific concerns of the legislators who had wavered, finding compromises that preserved the essential heart of the bill without gutting it. Carol's organization had mobilized. The story had continued to travel, finding new audiences, new voices, new people who added their own stories to the weight of it. Marcus Webb, the journalist who had written the first piece, had written 2 more. He was careful and honest, and he had, I came to understand, a daughter of his own, 9 years old and healthy, and I think that had something to do with the care he took. A senator from the eastern part of the state had become a champion for the bill in a way no one had predicted. Her name was Diana Forsyth. She had no personal connection to pediatric illness. She had no obvious political incentive. When a reporter asked her why she was putting so much effort into this, she said, because a 7-year-old girl made a list in purple crayon and asked if someone could please fix this, and I couldn't find a good reason to say no. That quote was everywhere. It made people cry. It made me cry. It would have made Ellie roll her eyes affectionately because she always got a little embarrassed when she became the story rather than the idea. Ellie was not able to follow the details closely by then. November was hard. She spent more days in the hospital than at home. The medications had changed several times, and each change brought its own adjustments, its own particular costs. There were days she was sharp and present and herself, recognizably entirely herself, funny and curious and fiercely there. There were other days when she was somewhere further away, behind glass, visible but not quite reachable. On the days she was there, we talked. She asked about the bill. She asked about Priya, who had gone home by then, in remission, an outcome that made Ellie genuinely happy in a way that included absolutely no bitterness, which tells you something about who she was. She asked about Jacob, who was still in treatment. She asked about Thomas, the quiet boy with rain-colored eyes, who I did not know the latest on and told her I would find out. She asked me, one afternoon, to describe the ocean again. So I did. I described the evening walk on the beach, the shells in her pockets, the way the light had gone gold, and the water had been cold, and everything had smelled like salt and possibility. She listened with her eyes closed. When I finished, she said, "It was perfect, wasn't it?" I said, "Yes, it was." She said, "I'm glad we went." On the 14th of December, the bill passed its second legislative vote. I was in the hospital cafeteria when Patricia called me. I was holding a cup of bad coffee and looking out the window at the parking lot and the gray sky above it and the first few scattered flakes of what was going to become the year's first real snow. My phone buzzed. I picked up. Patricia said, "Rachel, it passed." I didn't say anything for a moment. The snow was coming down more steadily now, the flakes catching the yellow light from the parking lot lamps. She said it needs the governor's signature, which we believe we have, but the hard part is done. The vote is there. This is going to happen. I said, "Okay." I said, "Thank you." I said, "I need to go tell Ellie." She said, "Please do." And Rachel, she said, this would not have happened without her. Make sure she knows that. I walked back to Ellie's room. She was awake, propped up against pillows, Captain Biscuit tucked in beside her. She looked at my face when I came in. She was very good at reading my face. She said something happened. I sat on the edge of her bed. I took her hand. I told her. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I started to worry, and then I saw her face, and what was on it was not worry. It was something I can only describe as a deep private satisfaction. The face of someone who set out to do something and has seen it begin to happen. She said, "The parents will be able to stay?" I said, "Yes." When the governor signed it, yes. They will have the right to stay without losing their jobs or their pay. She said, "Good." Then she said, "Mom, that's all I wanted. I want to tell you the next part carefully. I want to tell it the way it actually was, not softened or simplified, because I think you deserve the real version, and I think Ellie would want me to tell it honestly." She died on the 22nd of December. It was 8 days after the bill passed its vote. It was 3 days before Christmas. It was a Thursday, and it was snowing, and she had been, for the previous 2 days, mostly sleeping, with intervals of waking that were brief and quiet. Daniel and I were both there. My sister was there. We had been there, all of us, for 48 hours, taking turns sleeping in the chairs and holding her hands and talking to her in the low, calm voices you use when you understand that someone is traveling somewhere you can't follow, and the most you can do is walk with them to the edge and tell them it's okay. I held her hand. I told her about the snow. I told her Captain Biscuit was right there beside her. I told her we loved her more than every star in every sky in every world she had ever drawn. I told her she had done something extraordinary. I told her we were going to be okay. I don't know how much she heard. I believe she heard enough. She left us quietly, the way she had arrived, without drama, with a kind of dignified peacefulness that I have no adequate words for. The snow kept coming down outside the window. Daniel and I sat on either side of her for a long time in the quiet room with the machines no longer beeping and the fairy lights we had brought from home strung above her bed, casting everything in soft gold. I don't know how to tell you what grief is like. I suspect if you've been there, you already know, and if you haven't, my words will only ever be approximations of it. I can tell you that in the days immediately after, the world had a strange texture to it, simultaneously too sharp and too muffled, like a photograph that is in focus on the wrong thing. I can tell you that small things undid me completely. The smell of her shampoo, a purple crayon on the kitchen counter, the way Daniel would start to say her name and stop, his mouth holding the shape of it. I can tell you that the grief was enormous, and that it was also underneath the enormous, underlaid with something else. Not comfort, not yet, but something, the beginning of something. The governor signed the bill on the 9th of January. Patricia sent me the photographs. There was a ceremony at the Capitol, nothing too large, dignified and simple. Patricia spoke. Carol spoke. 3 parents who had been directly affected by existing gaps in family leave policy spoke about their experiences with a plainness and specificity that made everything real in a way policy language never quite does. And Patricia, when she addressed the cameras at the end, spoke about Ellie. She said, "This legislation exists because a child looked around her and noticed something unfair. And instead of accepting it, she wrote it down in purple crayon and asked her mother to please make sure someone fixed it. This law carries her voice. Every parent who stays at a bedside because of it will benefit from the courage and clarity of a 7-year-old girl named Eleanor Calloway. We named this act in her memory. They called it the Eleanor Act. I watched the footage at home on my laptop, alone. Daniel was in the other room. I didn't tell him right away. I needed a minute with it. Just 1 minute. just me in the name of it, the Eleanor Act, and the particular impossible feeling of a child's voice becoming a law. I thought about that afternoon on the back porch in May, the sketchbook open in her lap, the smell of burnt toast, the way she had pulled out that folded piece of paper and handed it to me with her small, serious face and said, "I made a list in case it would help." I thought about Thomas, the quiet boy with rain-colored eyes, and every child like him and every parent who would now be able to stay. I thought about the children in hospitals right now, tonight in every city, and their parents standing in parking lots making impossible calculations, and how some of those calculations were going to be different now because of a list in purple crayon. It has been almost 2 years since the Eleanor Act was signed into law. In that time, I have heard from hundreds of families who have used it, parents who were able to stay through a surgery, a father who kept his job while his son underwent 6 weeks of treatment, a mother who used the protected leave to be present for her daughter's last 3 months and has written to me twice to say that she does not know how she would have survived the aftermath if she had not had that time. I keep every letter. I keep every email. I have a box for them now, an actual physical box, which I did not intend to fill up as quickly as I have. I have also heard from the other children. From Jacob, Ellie's movie debating friend from the ward, who is now in remission and has started a YouTube channel about animated films that is exactly as passionate and detailed as you would expect. From Priya, who sends me a chess update every few months and who is apparently frighteningly good. I have not heard from Thomas, the quiet boy, and I do not know how he is, and I carry not knowing that the way you carry certain things, gently with hope. I have gone back to work, though differently than before. I work with Carol's organization now, part-time, helping families navigate the systems and resources available to them. I am not a policy expert. I am not a lawyer. I am a mother who learned something about what children know that adults sometimes forget. I do my best to be useful. People ask me sometimes how I keep going, how I get up in the morning with this specific weight of absence in the house, the empty chair at the table, the room with the fairy lights still strung above where her bed used to be, how I do the ordinary things, the grocery shopping and the bill paying and the bribing and the breathing. I tell them the honest answer, which is that I don't always know. Some days are simply hard. Some mornings the kitchen light falls wrong, and I am back in April, and she is eating cereal and mispronouncing spaghetti, and everything is fine, and then I blink, and it is 2 years later, and I'm standing at the counter with my coffee going cold in my hand. But here is the other honest answer. I keep going because she asked me not to stop, because she trusted me, because she made a list in purple crayon and handed it to me with her small, serious face, and that trust has weight, and that weight has direction, and the direction is forward. I keep going because somewhere tonight, in a hospital room that smells of antiseptic and is lit too brightly and is full of the particular bravery of small people enduring big things, a parent is there. Just there, sitting in the chair beside the bed, holding the hand, not choosing between love and livelihood because a law says they don't have to choose. A law with my daughter's name on it. A law that started with a 7-year-old who noticed something unfair and said, someone should fix that. She was right. Someone could. Someone did. She did. Ellie, if some part of you is out there somewhere, able to hear this, I want you to know that it worked. I want you to know that the list helped. I want you to know that every single day, somewhere in this country, a parent is staying. And they're staying because you paid attention and because you cared and because you would not accept the idea that the unfair thing just had to be the way it was. I want you to know that Captain Biscuit is on my bed now, which I know is a little embarrassing, but there it is. I want you to know that the garden is coming in this spring, that the flowers are being brave again the way they always are. I want you to know that your father made Sunday brunch again this week. It was still slightly burnt. We ate every bite. I want you to know that I trust you too. I always did. I always will. In memory of all the children who teach us more than we know how to say.